Has this been a fun week or what? The speakers that I've been listening to have been pretty good. And what a treat to have Dr. Schultz and Colonel Eidsmoe at the same time. What a 1-2 punch on the relationship of the biblical worldview to our status as American citizens they are. That has been a real treat. Meanwhile, I get one last shot at trying to talk about the Christian worldview and literature and the kind of relationship we should have to literature. And so I've chosen as my title for this last talk, Jurassic Jubilee. You remember Jurassic Park, right? So this doesn't mean that you're going to be devoured by T-Rexes or anything like that during the next hour. Literary friendship, dinosaurs, and the revivification of our literary legacy. What have dinosaurs got to do with literature or friendship? Well, let me see if I can explain. When I was in seminary in the mid-'70s, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, I had the great privilege of sitting at the feet of J.I. Packer. He gave a church history course on Puritanism, where we received in oral form the notes that eventually became the book, A Quest for Godliness, which is a book you want to get a hold of if you don't have it. And I remember in that class thinking to myself, our professor speaks of Jonathan Edwards, Richard Baxter, John Owen, Richard Sibbs, Thomas Boston, and William Perkins as if they were his personal friends. And he knows them well enough to do so. And I said to myself, I want to be like that with these men, and with Luther and Calvin and Spencer and Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton too. I would later add Homer, Sophocles, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Virgil to the list. And it's kept getting longer ever since. Now, it's a metaphor, of course. One cannot literally be personal friends with people who died well before one's own life ever began. But what Packer had done, and what I wanted to do, was to absorb their work in the context of their times so thoroughly and sympathetically that it would be an appropriate metaphor. I also have the ambition of getting this microphone positioned so that it will work reliably. I wanted to do what Packer had done, that is, to absorb their works in the context of their time so truly and thoroughly and sympathetically that it would be an appropriate metaphor to call them my friends. As indeed, I think it was an appropriate metaphor for me to think of them as his. My life has been enriched beyond measure to the extent that I have succeeded in that quest. From that experience emerge 3 theses for this last lecture this week. 3 theses about literary friendship. 1, I cannot think of any approach to literary study other than this that is worth taking. Now, okay, we have to probably extend the metaphor a little bit to add literary acquaintances along with your friends, because you can't really be literary friends with all the authors you need to know about in order to be a student of literature. But if we extend the metaphor in that way, I think we can make it work. I cannot think of any approach to literary study other than this that is worth taking. Thesis number 2. Therefore, any ideology, any critical theory that tells you it's impossible is to be rejected out of hand as a betrayal of writers and their readers. Any ideology or critical theory that makes literary friendship impossible must be rejected out of hand as a betrayal of writers and their readers. And then thesis 3, therefore, the old Western men and dinosaurs who can help you pursue literary friendship are the teachers you want to follow above all others. Those of you who have read enough of C.S. Lewis to have gotten to De Descriptione Temporum, which I'll explain to you in a bit, will get the reference here. The old Western men and dinosaurs who can help you pursue literary friendship are the teachers you want to follow above all others. So, let's think about each of these theses in turn. Number 1, I cannot think of any other approach to literary study that's worth taking. My first conscious awareness of the phenomenon that Packer brought into focus as literary friendship was the result of my high school English teacher's best efforts to prevent any such thing from ever happening. In fairness to them, they taught me English grammar very thoroughly, something their successors somehow neglected to do for my college freshmen. But on the other hand, they did their level best to make me conceive of reading literature as an effete exercise in puzzle solving. Fortunately, Robert Frost had gotten to me first. In my sophomore year of high school, a sequence of events played out for which I have been forever grateful. There was a weekend hike in the woods of the northeast Georgia mountains that set me up for my first reading of Frost's The Road Not Taken and Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, which set me up for the discussion of those poems that took place in class the next Monday. My most fundamental ideas about the nature, purpose, and value of studying literature were etched in my mind on that day. It was a perfect fall morning with the bright sun glinting off the yellow leaves that were sifting through the air like snowflakes. I was hiking the trail that followed the Tallulah River up ever deeper into the hills, utterly enchanted by the beauty that surrounded me and drawn on by the lure of what lay around the next bend. For the hills and the creek leaping down them were steeper and more wild and more compelling with every step. As I would express it later, free from the load of tent and sleeping bag, you pay by being more a slave to time. Measure it by watch or sun, the snag is there, though slopes are easier to climb. It is the time you have to turn around to make it back to camp or car by night. It is a law inexorable, profound, and it will win, though not without a fight. It's best to set a time that has some play. You cannot go but that you feel the spell. The hidden barrier that bars your way asks to be pushed a bit, ere it can quell the voice that calls you on. It has no end, the lure of what lies just around the bend. So that's where I was. But I was under strict parental orders to be back to our campsite by a set time so that we could get back home in time for my dad to make it to his second shift on the job. So there came that moment when, though it was the last thing I wanted to do, I had to turn around and head back. And I became aware in a new way in that moment of the finitude of time, of how it makes choices matter, and how the limits it places on our enjoyment of nature and its beauty make them all the more valuable. The law of supply and demand is just the first step in probing this mystery. I became aware in a new way of the mystery of life. Step 2 in this sequence was doing my English prep when I got back to school. Now, of course, like any diligent student, I was doing my homework in homeroom before first period began. And it was to read these 2 poems by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken and Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Now, I'm telling you, I had been set up because I'm just getting back from this trip and this hike and these leaves sifting through the air like snow. and the necessity of getting back and the desire to go on and the conflict and thinking about it on the car ride home and thinking about it overnight and not being able to put into words the insight that was trying to grow inside of me. And then I opened my English book. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. And sorry, I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then to where it bent in the undergrowth. Now, I'm supposed to know this poem. Then took the other just as fair, though having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that day equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. But knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. How did Frost know that? I shall be telling this with a sigh. Here I am doing it. Exactly what he prophesied that I would do. I will be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Okay, now his was two roads splitting. Mine was one road forward, one road back, but basically my road and his are inhabiting the same universe of meaning. And then, if that wasn't enough, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, though I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Those two poems. Now, the roads in the yellow wood diverged to the right and left, while mine presented the choice of going onward or back. But the choice and the difference it makes were perfectly parallel, potently parallel. The speaker in the snowy wood and I, in the yellow one, both wanted to stay longer, but we both had promises to keep. Now, I knew nothing about Robert Frost then, not even that he had just died a couple of years earlier. But I knew that if we ever met and got talking about walking in the woods, we would understand each other. The insight I had groped for but could not put into words, he had put into words. Words so perfect that you couldn't alter a single syllable without detriment to the statement. Now, that is poetry. The nodded heads of mutual understanding. Do you like that? Which C.S. Lewis defined as the essence of friendship in his meeting of Arthur Greaves, were there. Lewis had visited Greaves in his sick room and found his head bowed over a book they both loved. And they're both looking at each other and say, do you like that? Yeah. Instant friendship. So, this provided a bedrock foundation, the conviction that poetry could be an act of communication from author to reader that made literary friendship an appropriate metaphor. Why is literary friendship an appropriate metaphor for this relation between you and an author? Well, for me, the answer goes like this. If in meeting you, I say to myself, wow, this person loves the right things for the right reasons and can therefore help me love them better, I will want to be your friend. I will want you to be my friend. Well, what are the right things? truth, goodness, and beauty. If you love them and can help me see more of them, I want to be your friend. And if you lived years ago and can only do that through a book that you left behind, well, I'm not going to make an exception of you for a trivial reason like that. I will make as much of a friend of you as I can. Now, in a real, literal friendship, you have dialogue. And a literary friend, you can only hear more of stuff that he says by finding more stuff that he's written, which is already there and fixed. But you can go looking for it, and you can read the other stuff over again, and you can receive it, and you can get to know the mind that wrote those words. And you can make literary friendship an appropriate metaphor. Okay. Step 3 was English class the next day. Our teacher wanted us not to be satisfied with a surface understanding. In this, she did well. But her approach had unintended consequences deadly to the very possibility of the kind of literary friendship that can make someone a lifelong reader. Stopping by woods, she said, looks like a simple poem about nature. But it's really about a death wish. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, and the speaker has miles to go before he sleeps. So the wood represents death and its freedom from the hassles, promises of life. Right. Most of us could not see it at that point, but we had to pretend that we could if we wanted a good grade. You begin to see the problem. Now, I want to be clear that my issue here is not with the lady's interpretation. It was not without merit. My problem is with the way she presented it. The poem looks like it's about A, but it's really about B. I could not yet explain why, but thanks to Frost, I already knew better. No, the poem really is about watching the snow fall in the woods. If you get no more out of it than that, you have gotten something real and important. Now, indeed, you've even gotten the most important thing that's there. If the poem is also about anything else, it is so by virtue of what it says about the snow and the woods. If there is another meaning, we reach it legitimately only by attending to the snow and the woods as if they were there for their own sake, not as a mere disguise for something else. Probably without intending to, our teacher was asking us to treat the poem as a puzzle we had to solve, not as a medium of shared experience that might have implications, as many experiences do, for something beyond itself. The nodded head, the shared experience, the metaphorical literary friendship disappears and is replaced by an imposed exercise in puzzle solving. Is this reminding any of you of any English lit classes you've ever been in? It's no surprise that most of my classmates who had not been protected against this bait and switch by the sequence of events I had just been through became people to whom poetry was pretty much irrelevant for the rest of their lives. I, on the other hand, am telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in the class, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Yes, literary friendship is the only approach to the study of literature worth taking. It allows for all the analysis, all the pursuit of symbolism into which our teacher wanted to initiate us, but it keeps it healthy and humane and sane. And it gives us a good way of evaluating that analysis. If the analysis of structure, context, resource, symbolism, or what have you deepens the friendship, that's a good sign. If it leads you away from it and turns the shared experience into a mere puzzle you have to solve, not so much. Thesis 2. Literary friendship is the only approach worth taking. Therefore, any ideology, any critical theory that tells you such literary friendship is impossible is to be rejected out of hand as a betrayal of writers and their readers. There was a disconnect between the good my English teacher wanted to do with her teaching and its actual effect. Why? Because she had a theory of what literature is and how it works that didn't completely match the reality. Yes, our contemporary critics are right. Theory matters. But they are horribly wrong about the theories they hold, and just as wrong when they classify as resistance to theory any position that thinks they have the wrong ones. The theory my high school English teachers followed was called New Criticism. It seemed like a good name at the time. Okay? When you come up with your brilliant idea and you name your movement, be careful what you call it. You know, people make mistakes. New College Oxford. Oxford University has like 39 different colleges that are part of it. New College Oxford sounded like a good name at the time. The time was like 1,300 years ago. And it was like the fourth of the colleges that had been started, and it was the new one. And it's still called New College today, even though it's old. And not only old, but one of the oldest colleges. Postmodernism. It's like nothing's ever going to come after that. What do we have next? Postmodernism? Postmodernism? I mean, seriously, do a better job when you name your movement that you're going to be remembered for in history for 500 years. New Criticism. Sounded like a good name at the time. New Criticism dominated the study of English and American literature in this country from the 1930s through the 1970s. Starting in the 1980s, it began to give way to deconstruction and other forms of postmodern critical theory that have dominated since and all but destroyed the humane value of literary study. New Criticism was vastly superior to what it replaced, but we will not fully understand it or the current ideology unless we see that it opened the door to the destruction. You can just remove the syllable con from deconstruction and you'll have a more accurate word. The destruction that followed. The value of New Criticism was that it was based on a real truth. A literary text is a work of art and ought to be studied as such. Its weakness was the way it pushed that truth to an extreme that caused it to buckle into a self-contradictory lie. English was a relatively new subject in Britain and America at the end of the 19th century. Before that, you studied Latin and Greek, or maybe French and German literature in college. It was felt that nobody needed to go to school to study their own literature. I mean, educated people would naturally do that on their own. When British and American literature became a school subject, its teachers floundered around for a while trying to figure out what to do with it. There was much concentration on the life of the author or his philosophy. Important and interesting things, no doubt, but were they what literature is about? The new critics argued that literature needed to be studied as literature, as a collection of works of art. They had their own techniques and rules that needed to be understood to fully appreciate them. The focus was on aesthetic experience more than ideas, on structure and technique more than content. The new critics also defended literature as a legitimate source of its own kind of knowledge, different from but not inferior to science. It gives you knowledge of human nature and the human condition through vicarious imaginative experience. In all of this, as far as it goes, the new critics told the truth. Several key contributions of new criticism have remained influential. First, the technique of close reading. Minute analysis of the details of a text in terms of its structure, figures of speech, etc. This was the legitimate application of new criticism's valid insight about literature. It is an art form. Unfortunately, its influence did not stop there. The second influence of new criticism that has lasted is the concept of the intentional fallacy. This doesn't mean a fallacy you commit on purpose. Overreacting to the equation of literary study with knowledge of the author's biography in the previous period, the new critics insisted that the work of literary art be studied as an artifact in itself, an aesthetic structure independent of its author once created. Looking for the author's intention was held to be an irrelevant distraction in the process of interpretation. It became a fallacy, so-called, even to consider the author's intention. Looking for the author's intention was held to be an irrelevant distraction, and it became a fallacy even to consider what the author's intention might have been. So, we don't have the author here. The text has to stand on its own. Don't worry about what the author intended. Just read what the words say. And like all of the most dangerous lies that have ever been told, it has an awful lot of truth in it. Because if it wasn't for the truth, the part that's a lie would have no power. But wait, there's a problem with this, and I think I can quickly show you what it is. Did new critics like Wimsatt and Beardsley, John Crowe Ransom and Cleanth Brooks intend for us to ignore the author's intention when they wrote their own works, advising us to do so? They certainly did, and we as their readers know that they did. This self-contradiction at the heart of one of their key dogmas should have told them that something was amiss. They had pushed their valid insight a step too far. Yes, the text is an artifact with a life of its own. Yes, only its language and structure can tell us what it means. But to act as if the person who wrote these words and created these structures is irrelevant as to why they are there and what they are trying to do is to undermine our own ability to talk about them. Because sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Then the meaning we intend when we write about them can't count either. And that is what ultimately reduces a puzzle to a poem. Now, a poem to a puzzle. Now, Dr. Schultz and Colonel Eismo have been talking about the interpretation of the documents, the founding documents of American history, the interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court. And one of the reasons why that kind of thing has gone so far off track is because lawyers were paying attention to law, and philosophers were paying attention to philosophy, and theologians were paying attention to theology, and none of them were paying attention to what was happening in the study of English literature. But guess who was teaching people how to read? People who think like this. And so, yeah, what happens when the ideas behind the intentional fallacy make it into the seminaries? Then all of a sudden the interpretation of Scripture blows up. And what happens when it sneaks into the law school? And then all of a sudden you've got a living constitution. And what happens when we try to counteract those movements and our arguments, which are valid and good and historically grounded as those guys' presentations have been, have no traction? Why not? Because everybody was taught to read by these people. And so when somebody talks about the living Constitution, it just makes sense in terms of the assumptions people have been given by the way they were taught to read. You can't isolate the reading of the Constitution or the reading of Scripture from reading. So, I would argue we need to pay a lot more attention to what's going on in our English departments, because the hermeneutic that you're getting there is what people are going to take with them into life and take for granted. Okay, There's a reason why we're having to try so hard to defend originalism and strict construction. It's because the entire educational system is a conspiracy to undermine it. It's not just the law schools or the seminaries. Well, apart from the points at which they overreacted to previous errors, the new critics made a permanent, valuable contribution in reminding us that literature is an art form. It may be more, but it is never less. Unfortunately, their error has had at least as much influence on the next generation as their sound teaching did. I would suspect maybe more. The intentional fallacy acted as a catalyst to intensify the ongoing chemical reactions of anti-didacticism and anti-authoritarianism that were already going on in the modern world and produced a toxic brew that has now completely poisoned the literary well. The modern world became the postmodern world when the wall erected by new criticism between the author and the text kept growing taller and thicker until it fell over and killed both the author and the text. Our current critics take as a fait accompli the death of the author. It's the default setting for them. The death of the author. The death of the author, which is proclaimed by people like Foucault and Derrida and Roland Barthes. And my response to them is, if you really believe in the death of the author, why is your name on the spine of your book? I mean, it really is that dumb. And yet, it is powerfully persuasive to our generation. And we have to fight like cats and dogs to try to get some traction against it, because human nature is fallen, and consequently it loves to get sophisticated theories fed to it that seem to justify its rebellion against all authority, including the authority of God. Postmodern critics believe with Derrida that language leads only to other language and never connects with the objective world. There is nothing outside the text. And with Foucault, that since objective truth is no longer conceivable, truth claims are and can be nothing more than disguised attempts to assert power over others. Because literature cannot have an objective meaning given to it by its author, it becomes just one more political battleground where dead white European males, dwims, try to impose their antiquated and oppressive values on unsuspecting readers and are resisted by the brave revolutionary deconstructionist with her liberating feminist Marxist agenda. I am not making this up. This is how literature is actually taught at most of our secular universities. Now, here's something about this constellation of approaches that has not been sufficiently noticed. It makes literary friendship impossible. How can you be friends with someone who is trying to impose outmoded values on you and ensnare you in false consciousness? We call this thing the hermeneutic of suspicion for a reason. Suspicion and friendship are incompatible. Your friends are not now the writers who invite you into a shared experience of truth, goodness, and beauty with their literary skill, which they have preserved from the past. Now, your friends must be your contemporaries who are your allies in the revolution, the rebellion against all of that. This whole current mentality undermines the study of literature on multiple levels. Not only does it make the kind of literary friendship I've been talking about impossible, inconceivable, it makes even textual analysis pointless and impossible. A century and a half ago, Matthew Arnold said that the purpose of criticism was to see the object as in itself it really is, and on the basis of that vision, to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. If these goals are quaint and naive because they're out of reach by their very nature, as current theory would tell you, then textual analysis is pointless. It's just a meaningless word game that can never take you closer to hearing your friend accurately and understanding him faithfully. If you do not hear these aspirations as quaint and naive, you have somehow escaped the corruption of contemporary theory. If you can hear them as quaint and naive, but reject that hearing, you understand the hill we have to climb. If you hear them as necessary and obligatory pursuits, yet with full recognition of the difficulties they involve, you might actually be able to have something constructive to say. You and I and the author, in other words, might potentially be able to be mutual friends together. Anyone who tells you that you cannot get closer to hearing your friend accurately and understanding him faithfully because it's a moving target, since meaning is endlessly deferred, as Derrida put it, anyone who discourages you from even attempting it in those terms is your enemy. He is the enemy of sound learning and good letters. He is the enemy of every author who ever picked up a pen and every reader who ever picked up a book. And he is the enemy of your soul. It does not matter how sophisticated he is or how persuasive he sounds. He has abandoned the search for truth by building everything on the self-contradiction that goes all the way back to the intentional fallacy. Do not listen to him except to expose his perfidy. Do not hire him to teach in your department or send your children to study under him or contribute your money to pay his salary. If you have done so, you were aiding and abetting the enemy. If you do so after today, you are the enemy. These are hard words, I know, but the very lifeblood of our civilization is at stake. John Gardner was not exaggerating when he said, every chance composition backs a lie. Every nonsense artist, deconstructionist, is a plague carrier, a usurper of space that belongs to the children of God. We need to rally to our friends, the authors who love goodness, truth, and beauty, and our contemporaries who are their friends. How do we do so? That is where the dinosaurs come in. All right then. Only literary friendship is worth pursuing. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't pursue it. Thesis 3. Therefore, the old Western men and dinosaurs who can help you pursue literary friendship are the teachers you want to follow above all others. Dinosaurs? Where does that metaphor come from? C.S. Lewis compared himself to a dinosaur in his inaugural lecture as professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge. As an old Western man, he was a throwback, able to help moderns understand the ancients because in many ways he himself was still native to the world that they inhabited. Even back then, he recognized himself as a member of a dying breed. His description of himself was accurate on more than one level. We have lived to see the second death of ancient learning, he wrote. If we were looking for a man who could not read Virgil, though his father could, we might find him more easily in the 20th century than the 5th. Lewis read the Aeneid in Latin right up to the time of his death. I can struggle through Virgil's Latin profitably, but for extended reading, I'm dependent on translations. The next generation of English professors probably won't give you that much familiarity with the foundational background text. But it's not just familiarity with text. The ability sympathetically to imagine foreign ways of seeing the world is also a victim of our current system. Lewis noted that Christians and pagans had more in common with each other than either has with a post-Christian. The current crop of postmodernists is even further removed from the ancient conventions. They are in many ways post-Christians. Lewis, in other words, was a person who could stand in the gap. He could introduce you to literary friends you might otherwise have missed. And he could help you to a relationship with them that might otherwise have been out of your reach. He had laid the foundation of literary friendship in his own life. He had done so supremely well. He had done supremely well what I define in that life as the beginning. He actually could put an English sentence together coherently. Let's see if I can. He had done supremely well what I defined as that life in the beginning of this essay. He had absorbed their works in the context of their times, truly and thoroughly and sympathetically. He had done the academic work required to put him in a position to do that, and he had reaped the fruits of that work and made them available to others as skillfully as it can be done. It made him a dinosaur in his own day. Now that English professors no longer even think of such things as their job, he is doubly a dinosaur, that is, an extinct creature in ours. And this is exactly why we want him and others like him as our friends. Our two metaphors, friends and dinosaurs, come together in terms of the chapter on friendship in Lewis's book, The Four Loves. 2 may be the ideal number for eros, he wrote, but not necessarily for friendship. Lovers look at each other, standing face to face, but friends stand side by side, looking together at something else, something they both have in common. If of 3 friends, A, B, and C, A dies, then B loses not only A, but A's part in C. With Charles Williams gone, Lewis will never again see Ronald Tolkien's response to Charles. As a result, he has not more but less of Ronald. Mutual friendships based on the same shared love are enriching in ways that transcend the math of adding the 3rd or 4th person. It's more like multiplication than addition. Anyone who's had the privilege of knowing a really good group of friends will appreciate the truth in these observations. They apply to literary friendships too. We not only want to get to know great writers as literary friends, we also want contemporary friends, literal friends, who share that relationship with us. Just listen to the conversation whenever 2 great lovers of the Lord of the Rings get together. If one of these friends has real expertise and can become our best teachers and professors, all the better. We also want a 3rd kind, friends like Lewis, who are themselves literary, not literal friends, but who can also introduce us to their own literary friends and help us to pursue those relationships. Then I can enjoy, say, John Milton's part in Jack Lewis and Jack's part in Milton, and how all of that is reflected in you, my literal friend. Well, this is why you cannot read a great book without wanting to talk about it, and why talking about it with the right people is so important. Let the conversations not be broken. Let them continue and let them deepen. What else are friends for? Now, most of the books have delightfully disappeared from my little table, but providentially, there are a few left just for you, and they don't necessarily correspond to what you see on the screen. One of them does, the Young Christian Survival Guide, book of apologetics that deals with 19 different questions that you're going to hear a lot and that you need to have good answers to. If you're a theology student or a pastoral ministry student or a minister, there are 3 books I want to really highlight for you. One would be 95 Theses for a New Reformation. Imagine if Martin Luther were alive today, and instead of being concerned with the corruption of late medieval Catholicism, he was concerned with the corruption of contemporary evangelicalism. What 95 Theses might we get then? That's the question I try to answer in that book. And it starts with reaffirming the basic principle of the Reformation and then goes on to look at areas where evangelicalism needs reform in order to remember who it is. I define evangelicalism as the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, as it was handed to the present by the Puritans of the Reformation of the 16th century, as it was handed to the present by the Puritans of the 17th century and the evangelists of the First Great Awakening in the 18th. And as a movement as a whole, it's completely forgotten that it is responsible for bringing that heritage, which is the best, most faithful preaching of the gospel, into the present and the future. There's also a theology book on the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, which is a Christocentric pneumatology and an exposition of the Gospel of Luke. I've been talking in this lecture a little bit about the relevance of literary study for theology, because, I mean, how we read the Bible has an awful lot to do with how we're going to understand it, and things like the Constitution. And so my own work reflects that. That is, you're seeing, I've been split evenly down the middle between being a minister of the gospel and a teacher of literature. By God's providence, He wanted me to deal with the cross-fertilization that would come from being completely immersed in those two disciplines. And so my lectures this week have reflected one side of it, and the books that have all sold out reflect that side. And there's some other stuff that represents the other side as well, which is all pretty important. So, here is my exhortation to you. Let the conversations not be broken. Let them continue and let them deepen. What else are friends for? I am so glad that you have been added to mine this week. Thank you.